Always a
That's
problem.
Vir
Ladies and
Sanghvi.
gentlemen, good evening. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Ajoy, for making this amazing film, which we'll talk more about. But before we go any further, I want to thank the British Council, not just for organizing this event, which of course is amazing, but also I think for the work the British Council has done all these decades in India. For many of us, the British Council has been a source of inspiration, a source of knowledge. It's kept the intellectual life of India going, not just connections between India and the UK. And a big hand for everyone on the British Council. Great film, I think everyone agrees with that. Secondly, what made you make it?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
You know, it's very funny that neither my book or the film were my ideas. Both were commissioned. Me being a political journalist over 4 decades, I never really thought I'd write a book on the Beatles, let alone make a film. So when my publishers, Penguin Random House, whom I've written several political books, came to me and said that they wanted me to write a book on the Beatles, I was quite astounded really, because I mean the chief editor of of Penguin Random House, I know her since she was a child, and she knew that I was a Beatles fanatic. But I mean, I certainly never wrote on music, and I told her that Meru, Meru Gokhale, and I said, Meru, I've never written on music. She said, I don't want a musical expert to write on the Beatles. We are doing a book to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Beatles coming to Rishikesh. So it has to be timed for the 2018 February, and we want to do that. And so there it was, me researching the Beatles, my favorite band of my teenage years. I belong to the Beatles generation. I grew up with the Beatles. And it was amazing to find that I knew nothing about the Beatles, although I was so fond of their music. Because I realized, and I almost discovered, that there was this huge India connect. And India meant so much to the Beatles. The Beatles meant so much to India. And there was this cultural osmosis that happened, which was amazing. Because they, along with their gurus, Ravi Shankar, as well as Maharishi, built this bridge between two vastly different cultures. And the unique thing about the Beatles, and I always point this out, because there have been these bridges built by small groups of people, two small groups of people, because intellectually, you can grasp this, but never as a mass culture. And what the Beatles really did, because they were pop stars, they were rock stars, they really connected India to the average young Britisher and the young Westerner from the book, because it's firstly an entire team working, not just me writing. But it was merging the past and the new shoots we carried out and the old footage which we found. So I think it was this hugely exciting experience.
Okay, so now the unanswered questions in the film. Was the Maharishi a charlatan?
So this is a question which I get a lot, both here and abroad, about, so what is your personal opinion about the Maharishi? Was he a fraud, or was he really a god man? And my answer to this is that I really don't know. I think a bit of both. Because
that's very wishy-washy.
No,
Be a little more categorical.
No. Let me
You're
elaborate.
knowledge of this stuff.
No, let me elaborate. That the Beatles gave. And completely exploited that. There was no question about that. And he did, to some extent, in his entire mission to the West, very much aware of how much money he could make, who are the people, his contacts, and everything. At the same time, there were people who he actually helped. There were people who genuinely felt good about transcendental meditation.
Who exploits people, gropes women, and still has some yogic path. There's no contradiction between the two.
Well, I mean, Saeed Nafi, who was there with him, and we tried to be balanced in the film. It's shown both sides to the Maharishi. But there are many people, even in Rishikesh, who genuinely believe he was a saint. I mean, for instance, that ranger, Nautiyal, who actually is a great guy because he is responsible for resurrecting the ashram. He's the one who turned that jungle, because the jungle had overcome the ashram after Maharishi abandoned it, because he ran into tax problems here. He just ran.
We're not going to go anywhere with this question, so let's move on. Why do you think they left? Because that's another of the unanswered questions in the film.
Well, if I had to choose the various reasons, if I had to choose one, I would say top of the list was John was desperate to get back to Yoko. John was looking for an excuse.
But after Paul had left, Ringo had left,
Yeah.
he could just say, I have a commitment and go. Was it necessary to do all this?
Well, John had to explain to really thought the Maharishi, and that was, John being naive as usual. He thought drugs could genuinely buy him that peace, that the demons inside. He was always so troubled that he wanted some rest, and he really thought that the mantra would work. But it really wasn't working for him. So I think that he already is, so he was very much vulnerable to, I think, that story about Maharishi. Now, mind you, the Maharishi was no saint in the sense that he was really interested in women. I mean, Mia Farrow, has some very interesting accounts, which she later denied, but she does write in her autobiography that while she was being initiated to a secret mantra, she suddenly found two hairy arms around her from behind, which later, after speaking to Prudence, she corrected and saying that's what they do at initiations. So,
Okay. It could be, but in the book, more than this, Magic Alex is really the villain.
Yeah.
Yeah, you think he just turned there?
Oh yes, Magic Alex was quite a guy, and he really felt he was just left behind.
Yeah.
And these four guys just abandoned him after John declared him as the guru. He was particularly worried.
And you can argue about the Maharishi, but Magic Alex was a charlatan, no? There's no getting around that.
Yes.
Okay, do you think it really... Sorry, one more thing on this. You have this woman talking about George going and meeting the Maharishi and saying he'd come to apologize many years later. Now, I interviewed Deepak Chopra, who, as some of you probably know, started out as the Maharishi's manager and kept up a relationship with the Maharishi and knew George. And Deepak said to me, this was on record on television, that he took George to meet the Maharishi because George asked him, and so far so good. He said, I'm sorry, and the Maharishi said, what? And he said, George then started crying and said, I never could tell the real reason, and thank you for keeping our confidence. And according to Deepak, the Maharishi then said, yes, I know I caught you with drugs, but so what? You think that could be accurate?
I don't think so. I mean, I checked this with Mark Lushram, who is the guru of the Beatles, in the Beatles history, and I do feel that Mark also feels because he fact-checked the entire film. One of the great things to have him on board was that, and he feels that what we've sort of portrayed is genuine.
Okay. So let's now go on, because we talk about the effect of the Beatles on India, and you said, I think quite accurately, that India, which had just been a former colony, a whole new generation of Brits heard about India again through the Beatles, and it changed their impression and their image of India. Supposing they hadn't had this problem with the Maharishi, supposing they'd stayed India fans, would things have been very different?
I don't think so, because I think George remained an India fan. He kept on coming back. Even Paul kept, made 2 trips. John made a couple of trips. Puzzles me is the case of George Harrison and India, and particularly today, where we make a lot about Hinduism, because George Harrison was certainly the most famous international Hindu we've had, and he did really convert, if there's anything like that in Hinduism, convert to Hinduism. He really lived like an Indian. When his mother Louise was on a deathbed, he was reading the Bhagavad Gita to her. When he himself died, he wanted his ashes, which Ravi Shankar did for him, to be immersed in the Ganga. So I think in many ways, so I'm very surprised that India has not embraced George more, embraced the Beatles more, and particularly this government hasn't embraced really the fact that George was so fascinated and captivated by Hinduism. Vivekananda, so which is Swami Vivekananda,
okay.
Totally different. But I mean, he certainly wasn't into lynchings at all.
Okay, so not so wishy-washy now, we're going to keep going on. You talked about the effect it had on India. Now, you and I are people who, unlike 90% of the audience, who actually heard these albums when they came out. And I know the effect they had on me. What kind of effect do you think it had on people of your generation?
I used to listen in the 50s to my brother's records of Elvis Presley, and then Cliff Richards came, old rock and roll. But once we started hearing the Beatles, the concept of the band, and the concept of a new kind of music, there was something very comfortable about the Beatles, something which is very difficult to define. The early Beatles is something I still really love them. There's something, when I'm down, I can listen to them, and I feel good. And my sister-in-law, whom I dedicated my book to because she was so fond of the Beatles, she died of brain cancer. And in her last stages, when she was in great pain and she couldn't do anything, the only music she could listen, the only thing that comforted her, were the early Beatles. So there's something about the early Beatles, and I checked it with Nasiruddin Shah also. We were at a show together and we discussed this. And Nasir said the same thing, that the early Beatles had some sort of magical effect on him.
You say that about the early Beatles songs, but what I find interesting is that if you talk about rock stars and their early songs, will Keith Richards ever write a song better than Satisfaction? Will Sting ever write a song better than Roxanne? Will Dylan ever write a song better than Like a Rolling Stone? But when you talk about the Beatles, you don't talk about I Want to Hold Your Hand or She Loves You. You talk about the stuff that came later. I mean, to listen to something like Side B of Abbey Road now, I mean, it's just genius, no?
Absolutely. I mean, that's quite something amazing about the Beatles' music. Yeah. Because, most bands go through a high. I mean, the Stones is a very, very good example where the Stones really reached a peak. What I call the Mick Taylor period, where Mick Taylor was in the band. And then from the early 70s, they started deteriorating, on the other hand. Of course, they had a much shorter span. But at the same time, there are very few rock bands who played their best music right at the end. because there's usually a decline. Individually, they were producing some good songs, but obviously far less impact than the Beatles as a band. But then John Lennon did these anthem songs. There was Imagine and Give Peace a Chance. And these have become anthem songs passed on from generation to generation. And and that's why John Lennon is probably the most popular Beatle in the world, because also he died in such a tragic manner. But I think that and I was listening to George again, and some of those songs are fantastic, really, individually. But of course, combined, they were magic.
Yeah. I dispute what you say about John Lennon, by the way. I think there's been a reappraisal of Paul McCartney, and I think Paul McCartney was probably the musical genius there, but we will agree to disagree on that one. But do you think they should have, if they had happened a little bit later, there would have been more of an Indian pop scene? You had the Savages mentioned and the Jets, but there wasn't that much in India immediately afterwards, was there?
Weren't that big in the world, if you remember, at that time, because new stars were coming up, and there was a totally different, era which was coming up. So I think India moved on, but again, magically, the Beatles, there has been a Beatles revival. I mean, it's really funny that on my trip to Rishikesh once, when I was researching the book, I found this family, and there was this 18-year-old girl who had dragged her parents, who were doing the usual Hindu temple round in Haridwar, and sort of Rishikesh main city, and then they had to come to the Beatles ashram. So I asked her that what is it? I mean, this is a band. She's 17, 18 years old, and the band which broke up last century, and she just simply said, I don't know, but they just appeal to my heart. So there's some emotional tug with the Beatles.
Yeah, I think the greatest Beatles expert in the audience listened to them in the 1980s, right? Michael, wasn't it? Yeah, it was about 20 years or so after they broke up. So it is timeless, the music. Okay, I'm going to throw this open. Any questions? Okay. Who was more influential, Beatles in India, Mahesh Yogi or Ravi Shankar?
I think Ravi Shankar influenced the Beatles far more. And I can tell you that this is what Patty told me, that because I got quite friendly with Patty and still am, that their 66 trip where Ravi Shankar took George and Patty, both of them very young, on a cultural odyssey across India. And that was the trip where George was introduced to Hindu spirituality, not just Hindustani classical music. And Ravi Shankar really was behind George, and through George, John, to really question the meaning of whether life is an illusion or not. I mean, some of the central questions of Maya and Dharma. And I think these were important questions. I recently discovered a conversation between Prabhupada, who started the ISKCON movement abroad, John, Yoko, and George, which was really interesting because Yoko was particularly asking searching questions about whether his version of Bhagavad Gita was the best version. But so, just to get them into this kind of spirituality, I think Ravi Shankar had a much bigger role. Not just music, because mind you, music, Hindustani classical music, and the influence of it is there, but it was much, much more. India meant much more.